Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our podcast today welcomes back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, who is here to give us an update on what's going on in Washington and at the Department of Education. Tom has worked in the public policy arena for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. He's a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy in the areas of higher education, workforce development, healthcare, veteran affairs policies, and the procurement of federal appropriations. Tom is also a good friend, and it's great to have him back on the show. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Drum, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
It's great to have you back as well. You're always so forthcoming and available to do these things, to give updates of Washington. I can't tell you how much I and our audience appreciates it.
Well, thank you. And I enjoy doing them as well. You know that my passion comes from higher ed policy and the ability to share. That's so this works well for both of us.
It certainly does. And speaking of higher ed policy, let's get to it. A lot of stuff going on in Washington. I guess the first thing is the COVID guidance being extended.
Absolutely. Two pieces of valuable information that help students as well as schools. The Trump executive memorandum that he included with two other executive memorandums and executive order that extended the benefits for students to not have to make those repayments and have the interest rate remain at zero. And then last Friday, on August 14th, the Department of Education followed up with additional guidance and extension of other flexibilities, those provisions that were included in the CARES Act. You'll recall, Drum, that's the economic stimulus package that was introduced and then moved quickly through Congress and was passed on March 27th. Included in that guidance was, among many other things, help for healthcare, but a number of proposals for elementary and secondary and higher education policy. One of the key areas in higher education policy were a number of areas of guidance around things like satisfactory academic progress, R2T4, which is the return of Title IV funds policy, guidance on audits and reports back to the department, and a host of other issues. Close to a week ago now, the department announced that they were extending all of the flexibilities and all of the guidance that they had put forth in 5 previous electronic announcements, going all the way back to May and coming all the way through to July. So in doing so, they said in general that all of the prior guidance was now extended either until the end of the calendar year, December 31st of 2020, or to periods after December 31st, 2020, if the pandemic is still not announced as being resolved and ended. What that means is not only will the borrower benefits, but a number of other guidance provisions go forward all the way through to the end of the year. Included in that package, the department also had a couple of exceptions. Those exceptions are things that, again, are good for students and good for institutions, predominantly focused yet again, as you would hope and expect, on students. The one that I think is most important and most beneficial, not that they all aren't, is the area of the extension of the leave of absence requirements for students. Under the law, it states specifically that an institution is required by law to withdraw a student if they've been placed on a leave of absence for 181 days in any 12-month period. Well, during COVID, the leave of absences have been used for a lot of experiential learning type programs where individuals had to be placed on a leave of absence because the internship, externship, clinic, or other experiential learning opportunity that would enable them to complete their programs, then sit for licensing and certifying exams in some disciplines, or just complete their programs through the portions that are more tactic and hands-on, is not available to them. So by no fault of the student, no fault of the institution, or the third party that's helping them complete that education, they were having to be basically stopped. And you don't want students stopping out for those reasons. So the department came up with a creative way to state that the leave of absence policy in the 180 days would be 180 days and any additional time up to the end of this calendar year. Once again, December 31st, 2020. So that gives us, at least for now, the ability to protect those students' interest and capability to complete their program, with the hope that obviously they can integrate back into their various experiential learning opportunities between now and the end of the year.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense to have happen. And I would bet that if the federal declared emergency around COVID is extended beyond the end of the year, that will be folded in with the leave of absence. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And again, what I was going to conclude with, let me touch on one or two of them, but you're absolutely right, Drum. What the department had said is they've still left this open-ended. So if unfortunately we get near the end of the year and we're still not out of the pandemic woods, so to speak, the ability for them to extend any or all of these is still there. A couple of the others, just very briefly, the department once again reminded the institutions that audits and the reports that are due to the department, specifically fiscal financial audits that had timelines that couldn't be completed because the auditors couldn't complete the work with the institutions, that's been extended for a 6-month period, so that there's recognition there that, again, the circumstances as they present themselves are causing delays in reporting. There are other areas under their R2T4 funds where they extended the ability for institutions to protect students from not having to return federal funds that are potentially needed because of the disruption related to COVID, even if they withdraw, as long as that is as a result of COVID, and made some other changes to ensure that some of the campus-based aid funds, again, continue to be able to be best utilized by students from now through the end of the year.
Yeah. And just for our audience, R2T4 is?
Return of Title IV funds. It's the circumstances where if somebody unfortunately did have to withdraw, let's say because they had COVID or a family member contracted COVID or the like, and they simply weren't able to complete their program, normally you would have to do a refund calculation and give back portions of the federal funds back to the federal government. The government is saying right now that because of these extenuating circumstances, keep the money. You're still going to be responsible if it's loan aid to repay it at a later point in time, but you keep that money because you might need it given the circumstances of the pandemic and the reasons why you had to stop out.
Well, sometimes I forget that, you do a lot of work with government entities. In fact, most of your work is. And, in the Navy, we had a DICNAV-AB, a dictionary of naval abbreviations.
I live in that world of acronyms. You're absolutely right. Alphabet soup is one of the things we affectionately call it.
Absolutely. And so, at least it's the acronyms instead of the anachronisms.
Absolutely.
Or maybe it's both. I don't know.
It could be both at times.
So a lot of things going on because of the COVID being extended, the leave of absence, the R2T4, academic calendars, they're in a little bit in flux as well, right?
They are. With regard to the academic calendar, they gave some relief to the institutions to help the benefit of students. The traditional academic calendar and academic year is a strict, rigid set of semesters in relation to weeks of instruction. For purposes of the pandemic, they've loosened some of those guidances, and they're temporary opportunities to loosen those guidances, again, to better accommodate the need while we were in the transition to online education, which we'll talk about those new regulations here in just a minute, I'm sure. But the opportunity for institutions to limit the number of weeks and still provide the number of semester, quarter credit hours, or clock hours to complete the academic year or academic term were modified because of the COVID circumstances and the need potentially to compress some of that. So again, to the benefit of the student, first and foremost, to enable them to complete abridged or abbreviated periods of their academic training, but also giving the latitude to the institutions to be able to deliver that in a more effective manner.
And which makes perfect sense. I know we had a guest on the show, Eric Boynton, who is the provost at Beloit College. And what they have done is they have changed their term length. Normally they're semesters. And what they're doing is having students take 2 courses, full credit in 7.5 weeks, and then in the next 7.5 weeks, be able to do 2. So they're going full time, but it gives them the flexibility that if they end up having to swap online, having to have students take 4 courses at any given time online is very difficult. It's much better 2 courses intensely, move on to the next 2 courses.
And to your point, that, and maybe this is you gave me just a perfect segue. This helps in things like standard and the opportunity for the changes that have come around in the regulations, where regular and substantive interaction between the instructor and the students in that type of paradigm that you just alluded to, again, by breaking it up into smaller chunks, the opportunity for the instructors to have more focused time with the students with the instructors as well, is provided. And so again, we're seeing things happen in the pandemic that are driving potential future and even current changes in some of the thinking of the regulatory process. Shifting to another set of new guidance that just came out, the Department of Education just this past Tuesday did a soft release of new and the last of 3 pieces of guidance around distance education, online education, and innovation. You'll recall from some of our prior podcasts that the department worked through the end of 2018 and 2019 on a whole new set of regulations that focused on online education and innovation, also had focused on...
That was negotiated rulemaking for 2019, right?
Correct, federal negotiated rulemaking.
Yeah.
And in addition to those key elements, they also had a separate set of subgroups, an ad hoc subgroup that focused on faith-based institutions and teach grants. All of this were information that were important to the community. And we've now seen, and coincidentally, those negotiations came about to consensus, meaning all of the parties from all of the different sectors of higher education and the department were able to obtain consensus on the entire sets of packages. That doesn't often happen given the varying views that are around that table. But nevertheless, in these areas...
It never happened before. That was the first time.
Well, it had way in the past, but not in recent years.
Okay.
You remember, I go all the way back to the first of these back in 98, 2000. So...
Oh, gosh, I thought that was back in 1978, Tom.
It seems like it sometimes, Drum. But the good news is that this most recent package also, yet again, built on the prior information, some things learned from present day. Again, regular and substantive was modified. Changes were made to help synchronous and asynchronous learning in the clock hour institutional environment. And there were other sets of circumstances that took place as part of these regulations that are all scheduled to go into effect on July 1st of 2021. Under the master calendar, which is a statutory requirement, any regulation that is Title IV driven must be introduced on or before November 1st of the preceding year to go into effect July 1st of the subsequent year. The good news is that because these were consensus driven and because it's taken a while to put them forward, the department and the secretary have the authority to grant institutions the opportunity to early implement if they so choose, as they did with borrower defense to repayment and gainful employment and some of the other regulations implemented in the past. They've now given this third set of distance education, competency-based education regulations the opportunity to be early implemented as well. And I think some institutions are going to take advantage of that because, again, of the regular and substantive changes, some of the changes with regard to transfers of credit, other changes that benefit specific types of institutions, including faith-based institutions. So I think we're going to see a lot of these start to be woven into the fabric of the delivery of online education, certainly between now and July 1 of 2021.
And what I'm seeing with this, it's a deliberate move to take things away from seat time to actual student learning.
It is. And again, I think that's one of the shifts is because of, and you heard me say it, the competency-based education, the ability to do direct assessment, the stackable credentials. The Moody report that just came out this week that spoke of non-degree certificate programs growing at a 10% rate, even at major colleges and universities. So showing that there is, I wouldn't say a full-out shift, but certainly a new opportunity for students to utilize online education to supplement, not necessarily supplant, certainly the bricks and mortar full 4-year degrees, but there are different ways to potentially attain that 2-year and then 4-year degree, or have certificate and diploma related programs still offered through online education using these regulations to excel or fulfill basic requirements while still potentially stacking them or having them capable of being stacked to reach that 4-year degree and then even go on to masters and others. So I think we are seeing some unique times in terms of higher education delivery as a result of the pandemic. One of the things Moody said, the Moody report said, was it took probably the pandemic to move what would have been a more glacial pace of change to, and something that would have taken a 5 to 7 to potentially 10-year period, and has accelerated it based on necessity out of nothing else. And as we all know, though, it's the old adage, necessity is sometimes the mother of invention.
Well, it reminds me of what Gordon Gee, who I know you know Gordon, the president of West Virginia, he had said on a podcast, months ago, was the pandemic is accelerating needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more. And that's what we're seeing.
Yep. And the Moody report reflects that. And so do some of the other things we're just living in real time and experiencing. This is, I said it to my daughter that, we're living and experiencing history at a level right now that I don't think comes along all that often.
It really doesn't. And, I want to speculate a little bit and get your opinion. What I'm kind of seeing is a beginning of a shift away from the Carnegie method of measuring student learning to actual student assessment of learning.
I completely agree. Again, the notion, and that was part of what this round of negotiated rulemaking was attempting to address, the ability to look at, again, competencies. What are the skill sets more so than even seat time as the methodology for determining the actual progression and understanding and assimilation of what it is that the education that's being provided. So, those things are coming into play. The opportunity to look at prior learning experience and give credit for prior mastery of things that happened before entering the educational system. One of the areas where I think that has a very significant nexus is with our military and the number of individuals coming out of the military once they've completed their service to our country, and God bless them for doing so, but then having these various skill sets that, whether it's in true vocational or career settings or in disciplines that are more 2-year and 4-year degree-based circumstances, again, think of all the individuals that are involved in cybersecurity or in networking technology and other areas, to where the ability for them to take all of that applied knowledge, yet again, as a stepping stone into those various disciplines, is something that the challenge of how to integrate that, and service member opportunity colleges do an excellent job with that. They've had distance education before distance education was distance education. And so there is some of that adaptability that's already there, but we're seeing it change on a dynamic level in real time.
It really, it's well needed. I want to move on because we still got a few more topics to talk about. Title IX is huge, and it's about to come out if it hasn't already. I think it has.
It did. We're 14 days from the implementation date of the new Title IX regulations. For those of you not familiar necessarily what the reference to Title IX means, Title IX is a portion of the campus safety and security type issues around institutions of higher education. It includes everything from the Violence Against Women's Act and all of the various forms of hate crimes and individual crimes. VAWA specifically talks about bullying, cyberbullying, stalking, as well as domestic violence and other forms of, unfortunately, dating violence. that happens to individuals across the entire spectrum, men on men, women on women, man on women, and so on. What has happened is that under the Obama administration, there was a significant emphasis and focus on the protections of the victims. As time has passed since those regulations went into effect, there were some of the individuals that were the proponents of the accused that said that the pendulum had swung too far towards the victims' protections and not necessarily gave some of the same flexibilities and or protections for the accused. So we've seen a swing, as we often do in the regulatory process and in processes in Washington, D.C., swinging the pendulum back, some would say potentially too far. Others would say the right amount on protection of the accused as well as the victims. Some of the key areas of those very contentious regulations include cross-examination by the accused or a representative on behalf of the accused, not the individual themselves, of the victim. Those are certainly very anxious and concerned moments because, again, the victim's rights advocates say you're putting the individual that is the victim back on the defensive yet again and forcing them to potentially relive circumstances that none of us would want to see anybody go through. So some of these changes are very, very contentious. Many individuals up on Capitol Hill are continuing to have concerns and express those concerns with the Title IX changes. But what was published in final form in an NPRM that took literally over 2 years to complete are now final regulations. It does provide for, as I said, that cross-examination hearing processes that are going to challenge the way in which institutions do their review and investigation and then hearing of the facts on any particular case. It's modified specifically, I think, to the favor of the institution, limiting those number of individuals at the institutional level that have responsibilities for reporting and tracking of these type of allegations. Before, it had gotten a little bit unwieldy, and basically anybody that was talked to then had responsibilities to move up the chain. That's not to say that individuals won't do that, but there are more directed circumstances where the institution and whoever the accused or the victim have to go and seek support and help at the institutional level. So long-winded way of saying that all of these regulations are brand new. They did go into effect 2 weeks ago. Institutions are working very diligently to move forward on these regulations. The good news is that, as is often the case with new guidance and new regulations, I anticipate that the department will be forthcoming with additional electronic announcements with further guidance and the ability to share more information to help the students and also to help the institutions implement this. And we will also see as well some FAQs, frequently asked questions and answers, that will delve into specific case scenarios where, again, that information can help guide the development of policies and procedures and implementation of them at the institutional level.
And we're hoping to have a representative from the Department of Ed on the podcast sometime in the next month or so to be able to talk about this more in depth.
Yeah, Jim Moore, who is the senior policy advisor, might be the person you're thinking of. And he's phenomenal and does a great job of bringing this to life. He's worked on the Clery Act as well as other portions of drug and alcohol prevention. So he along with many in the Office of Civil Rights, are phenomenal individuals helping to protect our student body as they go through this maturation and the opportunity to go through school.
Well, that'd be great. We're coming up to the end of our time here. I want to hit some coming attractions. There's a lot going up on the Hill right now, new stimulus package. How about some prognostications here?
Don't have a crystal ball, but definitely can talk about coming attractions on some things that I think are relevant and important to your viewership and membership. First and foremost, I do believe the department will be coming out with more guidance on the higher education emergency relief funds. Again, the fiscal financing that was included in that CARES Act from back on March 27th. You'll recall that there were two facets of that funding. Half of the money that each institution of higher education received was specifically designated to go to students, the other half to institutions. The department has done a phenomenal job of providing guidance on both halves. We have probably all the guidance, or as much of the guidance as is needed on the student side, and the delivery of funds that were needed for the students based on the disruption of COVID, and the ability for those to be utilized for childcare, housing, food, and many, many other issues. The institutional side, we're still waiting for additional guidance from the department to make absolutely certain of how the institution can utilize those funds. There's been discussions around payroll. They've made clear through FAQs some of that guidance, but there's still more that we need and want for faculty purposes. There's also more on the institutional guidance side in terms of the reporting back to the department of those allocations, but a lot of schools have been slow to use the institutional side until they get more guidance so they make sure they're doing it in compliance. I anticipate that information will be coming forth from the department either just before or just after Labor Day. I think we'll be seeing more information in that regard. In terms of coming attractions from Capitol Hill, we all heard prior to the August recess that Congress and the White House, whether it be the Democrats with the White House, the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate working with themselves, the Democrats in the House having introduced their HEROES Act, which was their comprehensive over $3 trillion proposal for the next round of financial assistance, not only for institutions, but employers, the health professions, and the providers and the frontline providers fighting against the pandemic. All of those negotiations have been ongoing throughout the August recess. There have been basically some downtime over the last 2 weeks as we've watched both the national conventions now come and conclude. But again, I think you're going to see ramping back up in the very near future discussions yet again on the next stimulus package, whether or not that's the $1 trillion or thereabout that Republicans specifically in the Senate want, or the $3 trillion that the Democrats in the House want, or the normal splitting of the baby, which was supposed to be some of the negotiations between the Democrats and the White House. We'll see how it all plays out. I can't get into, in the time we have, all of the different permutations of this, but the Republicans have two bills out. They're both called the HEALS bill. The HEALS Act, which is the Senate Republicans' proposal. There's the skinny bill and the regular bill. The House has the HEROES Act. The president has his desires of what he wants or doesn't want in the bill. Some of the major contentious issues at the top level are issues around liability for the employer and the employees, certainly funding for state and local communities, which is a major, major issue for the Democratic Party, and trying to provide additional funds to state and local communities. At the higher ed level, the issues are more directed towards an elementary and secondary level, whereas higher ed got the larger tranche of funds in the CARES Act. It will have the reverse. I think you'll see more money going to elementary and secondary ed in this next iteration of the stimulus and relief bills, but higher ed will still get some as well. Key nuances, and this is what I'll close with, that are important. The Senate Republicans bill, and I think agreed on by Democrats, would make a retroactive change to the CARES Act, the prior money that I was talking about, that makes clearer distinctions on the use of those funds at the institutional level for both payroll and for lost revenue, which will be beneficial for the guidance for the institutions and the ability to direct how they utilize those funds. From the student's perspective, it will also expand beyond under cost of attendance, those areas of childcare, food, health, and technology and the like, to include tuition and fees. So again, benefits on both sides, that learning from the delivery of those funds and their utilization from March to the present, they're making some modifications and some technical corrections. I believe there will be also some other technical corrections to try and help all institutions with concerns around financial responsibility and some of the regulatory requirements that institutions must fulfill on an annual basis, the development of composite scores and other information that determines institutional eligibility. Make no bones about it, all institutions are hurting right now, whether it's state colleges and universities, small liberal arts schools, faith-based institutions, minority-serving institutions, or the proprietary sector. So all of them are going to need some relief when it comes to assessment of their fiscal positioning going into the next year or two, as they try and deal with current fiscal circumstances and the rollout of what it's going to take to bring them back to hopefully a better set of circumstances. And that protection is needed for all schools.
Absolutely. Now, any guess as to when we might see something actually signed by the president?
My assessment on that is, again, we're running up again at the end of the fiscal year. We all know that the congressional fiscal year runs from October 1 through September 31st. My assessment is that I think what you're going to see is there's probably going to need to be another continuing resolution before Congress can complete the work on all of the next appropriations bills. And we'll probably see this relief package and that continuing resolution melded together. So I suspect you'll see it by the middle or the end of September.
That would be good. I know there's a lot of schools out there who really need better guidance out of Washington, and they need more monies. Well, Tom, this is great. As usual, you've been a wealth of information for our listeners. I greatly appreciate all the time you spend with us and appreciate you as well.
Well, John, really, really enjoyed the time with you. And again, you're following and appreciate the opportunity to share this information. You know that, again, it's so important to me that students are protected and institutions are able to continue to do their best for our students. And it's challenging times for everybody right now. So we're trying to all make it through, my friend.
We certainly are. So again, thank you, my friend. And until next time.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting, for his Washington update with the Department of Education. Our next guest is Dr. Tom Mars, Assistant Director of Texas A&M's Center for Executive Development. Tom will be joining us to talk about employee and faculty burnout as a result of COVID and what university presidents can do to build employee and faculty resilience to weather this pandemic storm.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.